Hello everyone, welcome back to another fun piano lesson tutorial. Today's going to be part 2 on how to read sheet music and different things involving sheet music. Last time we covered some of the basics, so I got us set up with a little demonstration here. I kind of just threw a bunch of random notes on the page and different things that we're going to be talking about, so it may look a little overwhelming right now, but just remember everything we talked about last time when it comes to notes, and we're going to look at what else is new and what has changed. So the first thing that I want to talk about is key and time signatures, which you'll see have changed. I also changed for tempo, so hopefully you remember that from last time as well. But the first thing that has changed is the time signature has went from 4/4 to 6/8. So basically, here's what it means. There's two numbers, as we can see, top and bottom, only showing the first measure here unless it changes. And the top number basically means how many beats are in each measure. In this case, there's 6. The bottom number represents what I would basically call the default note, or as I may have mentioned last time, what is one beat equal to. So in a 4/4 type signatures, you would have 4 beats per measure, and that would mean that a quarter note is equal to 1 beat. So 4 quarter notes would complete one measure. Half note, half. Whole note, full measure. In this case, it's 6/8, so we see I have eighth notes here. So if we were to walk through this measure and piece out what each type of note is and how the math adds up, you've got an eighth note, a quarter note, an eighth rest, and 2/16 notes. Now I know that all might sound like a lot, but again, you just simplify them down. 2/16 notes equals 1/8 note. Right next to that, we have another eighth note. Next to that is a quarter note. A quarter note can be expanded to 2/8 notes. So that means that we have 2/8 notes. The quarter note represents 2. This represents 1/8, and this rest represents an eighth. So 16 and 8, 2/8, a quarter's 2, and this is 2. All in all, it's 6 beats, 6/8 notes. So that's how time signatures work. And they can change very much depending on songs and genres. For example, if you're playing waltzes, great genre to be playing in, you'll typically see a 3/4 time signature to get that dun 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 that you typically have in the bass clef. But most songs are in 4/4. The most common time signatures, 4/4, 3/4, which you can also see for a lot of rock songs are in 3/4. 2/4 every now and then, 6/8, and 12/8. There's a lot of different variations. The most bizarre one I've ever seen is of Them Bones by House and Changes in 7/8. That one's a little funky. So, and again, these change all the time from song to song. So that's what a time signature is now. Key signature is definitely more important. You'll see here, last time we had just a little sharp symbol notated here, like this accidental right here. And now we have 4 flat symbols, as we can see. The main thing to know about key signatures before knowing what it is you can tell what you need to know about the key signature without even knowing the name of it. So for example, this is the key of A flat. But what's relevant to me is that each of these flats or sharps, whichever it would be, denotes what note, what rule we have to follow. Basically, a key signature is a rule that you have to keep in mind. It's kind of like if you ever had a wild card in poker, you would have to abide by that rule for that game. In this case, we can see our first one's is on a B, so that would be a B flat, E flat, A flat, and D flat. I like the key of A flat because I always call it the key of bead. Bead is how I always remember that. And sometimes I won't even write A flat if I'm just writing notes on a song. I'll just write bead because it's always a good way for me to remember that. This is one of my favorite key signatures personally. And there's a lot of different ones. If I went here and wanted to change the key signature, you can see these are all the different key signatures there are. And there's major and minor modes and other modes as well. In this case, we're just going to focus on major. But the last time I said we were in the key of G. The key of C has no accidentals. And you can see they progressively get more and more and more until eventually you're playing almost entirely all black keys, right? So, and we're going to discuss that in other videos, how all of this interrelates with things like the circle of fifths. But for now, we're not trying to go too far down the rabbit hole here in music theory. So that's how our key signatures work and our time signatures. Now, something that a lot of people don't take advantage of when it comes to actually performing music is dynamical changes or dynamics. Sound dynamics is how loud or quiet something is. And when it comes to piano, we have a few different options. Um, I can't really say that there's one normal value because there really isn't. But what I can tell you is you can add up to as many different letters as you want to play something as quiet as possible, or on the contrary, as loud as possible, but it's not really realistic. Typically, what we see is pianissimo, which is dictated usually by two P's, which means very quiet or very, very quiet. One is piano, which technically means slow or slowly, but in this case it means quiet. We have mezzo piano, which is kind of quiet, medium quiet. And then we have mezzo forte, which is, kind of loud, a little loud. We have forte, which is loud. We have fortissimo, great word, really loud. And if you're really getting up there, you could keep it going and just go fortissimo. But that, again, you don't typically ever see that. This is typically the highest you would ever see in a song because you can't really play louder than that, and otherwise you'd probably be breaking keys off. So um, we do typically have a limit for this as to how many we see, and it's usually three. Um, so that's how we control our dynamics with the letters. So otherwise, you wouldn't know how to start if you were looking at a new song for the first time. You wouldn't know how hard to press the keys. You wouldn't know how loud or quiet it's supposed to be. And typically, songs have an introduction, or you like them to be quieter. Let's say I have this bracket over here, though. So let's say this was a middle chorus segment, and I was in mezzo forte. Well, this is called a decrescendo. Now, the opposite of this is a crescendo. So, for example, I could add in here. Where's my dynamics? There they are. I could add in a crescendo. And all this means is that I need to start progressively getting louder over the duration this bracket notates. So this could be saying, all right, for these three beats, remember quarter note, I want to go up to forte. Well, let's bring it back down to I could put anything I want here, or you could just leave it blank, in which you would just go to the next default value from where you were at. You would just move one dynamical range in volume. And that's typically how we see dynamics written out with crescendos, decrescendos, and what we call dynamic text is the most common thing to see. And this is what basically adds in the feels and emotions to music, in addition to how we manipulate notes. But for now, I'm going to get rid of that just to get rid of some clutter. Next thing I want to talk about is some more note manipulation. The one I'd like to talk about is called a tie. So I'm going to put another B here. So as I can see here, these would play separately, right? What if I wanted to tie them together? There's a tie. It's a little curved line. And basically all this means is that if I have a duration of a note that can't be covered by, let's say if I was in the time signature of 4/4 and I wanted to play three beats, well, I have the option of doing a rhythm dot, obviously, but I could also put a half, what did I say, three beats? A half note, and wait, I said that wrong. Um, this is hard for me to think about in 6/8. I gotta think here for a second. I'm sorry. How to put this in words. Um, if I wanted a whole note, I can't do a whole note in 6/8. You see, when I try and do it, it doesn't let me. Instead, I would have to tie notes over with the durations that I can do. So I add a tie. And now, this means that I am holding down this key the entire length of all of these beats. It doesn't change. You can also tie notes that are in series. So for example, if I wanted to hold this E down, I can just tie it. E flat, actually. um, I can hold it down. And now when this plays, that note won't be played more than the first time I hit it. And you can hear it holding in the background. So that's how ties work. And ties, can work for multiple notes. If you have a chord, you can tie each interval of the chord, just like that. Very great feature of sheet music and piano. Now, I know I've mentioned the word octave a few times, so I wanted to discuss how octaves look. I'm not gonna get into what octaves are. Again, we're going to cover that in a separate series. But let's already assume that you know what an octave is or that you've watched my series on that. Um, how does it change? So I'm going to jump down here. I'm making quite a masterpiece today. Let's say I start with a C. This is a C. If I go one octave up, you'll see how far up on the lines that I go. And this can continue. For example, let's say I was playing, I'm going to move all these up. This is now an A flat octave right here. So that's one way of doing it, manually, by showing it as notes. We can also play it in a normal range. So in this case, this octave again is the octave of C4. Let's say I had a G. Well, I have some tools here. I can go by pitch. I can move them half steps, down steps, or I can go up an octave, and that'll do it for me. But let's say I have a very cluttered song. It's got a lot of chords, it takes up a lot of room, it's hard to read. Well, instead of shoving a series of notes really far up in a range or really far down to where it's actually impacting your bass clef or the other surrounding lines, I can actually put a series of notes. We'll just put these three. And I can take them, and you'll notice that I can put a notation that says octave up or octave down. So if I want them to be played higher, one octave higher, you see this little 8 VA symbol. 8 oct. That's where that usually comes from. um, so now, when this gets played on the keyboard, it'll be up an octave, as you can hear. And you'll see that when we want it to go up, we put these dash brackets in the text over top of the notes. If I want it to be an octave down, I would do the opposite. So now when I put octave down, it'll be on the bottom. And this would follow suit for down here if I were to do that too. If I did octave up, it would be up top. If I did it down, it's on the bottom. So that's the other way that you can consolidate music to not be too cluttered when it comes to manipulating the pitch of different segments. Now, this is a more complex concept here. We're going to move on from that, which is something usually I just refer to them as triplets, but there are different types of triplets. There's duplets, triplets, quadruplets, septuplets. Um, there's different types of rhythm bursts that go out of the typical flow of a song. I have to think of where this would be. I don't usually write triplets. I think it would be under articulation. Uh, oh, rhythm. Right. I just said that. So here we can see our different options. The most common is a triplet. You'll see how this gets broken up with the rest that follow it. So I can put these in. This is a triplet. And I'll follow that with a half note. See how that sounds. So you see that everything is the same other than we put a little number to notate how many beats go for that specific burst. A good way that I always was taught to sound out playing through triplets um, is to just say the syllables. And you have to keep that in mind for the duration that you do it and also that your tempo. A great example of triplets that I love is in the song Happy Together by the Turtles. And in the outro chorus section, there's a great section that I always used to sound out by going triplet and then the chord that would follow. And It comes in very handy. A lot of classical music, they like triplets. Sebastian Bach utilized a lot of triplets in his pieces. Um, so these are great. Another great example is the the intro four measures of Piano Man by Billy Joel, a great piano solo introduction that utilizes triplets. Though it's a little bizarre, one of the triplets actually only has two notes, so these can get very complicated. That's basically how these work. Um, Now, I know we've discussed tempo, what tempo is, how we see it written, but tempo can be manipulated in a song. For example, again, more Italian, accelerando and ritardando. You typically will see ritardando more frequently. Anytime a song comes to a very drawn out, dramatic ending, we want to slow down how fast we're playing to come to a conclusion, to add in dramatics. And the way we can do that is with a ritardando, which is typically just notated with RIT dot. Now, Note Flight likes to put that up top. I personally like to see them in the middle of the music and bolded, similar to how we saw the dynamic text. Um, but everyone has their own style of notating that when it comes to composing music. Um, the opposite is if we were to go on really quick runs or riffs. Um, the way you can typically notate that is with an accelerando. You could think of a lot of jazz musicians. The theme to La La Land is a great example of where runs would be accelerated. Um, and so you can notate that similarly using accelerandos. Now, fermatas typically are also used in the conclusion of songs, but not always. Suspenseful moments, they're intended to build suspense or to be of a sustaining nature. Um, Pretty much just tells you hold the note for a little extra longer. You don't want to release it just yet. You're going for dramatics. Um, so we're gonna hold that note and we're gonna milk it a little bit, basically, is what it means. And I know a lot of this sounds a little funny or fictitious now, but when you're actually playing, and depending on every song is different, you kind of get into you relate to the emotions or the feels of songs, as people often do with music. And so you can work to manipulate these on your own to see how they come into play. Um, Beyond tempo, another concept I'd like to talk about is repeats. Repeats are very useful again for consolidating sheet music when you have choruses or a lot of parts that are redundant. Instead of writing them out over 16 pages, we can utilize repeats and codas, which we're going to talk about next. You can see some of that hiding here, and my uh, mess of the sheet music. Uh, and they can be used to condense down redundant sections. So typically, as you're playing a song, what you would first see, I'm going to do it on this measure here, you would see this giant open bracket. Now, this one is a little excessive, but it has little flares on the end. Sometimes it would just be a normal looking square bracket with these dots. And that signals to you you're entering a section of the song that's going to be repeated. So let's say for whatever reason, I just wanted to repeat this measure. I could add in here on the repeat and end repeat. And now what that means is that as I'm playing, I've entered this section. That doesn't mean anything yet. But when I hit this end repeat, I now have to jump back by rule to where the beginning repeat is. And this can be nested, kind of like programming or mathematics, where they're kind of like parentheses and you have to work your way outside of them. Um, but typically, we don't see that. So, for example, if I play this, you'll have to bear with me. I'm not entirely sure how this is going to sound. You'll see that the player cursor here repeated this section and then went through it. So if you want to repeat something multiple times, that would have to be notated in text, or you can have different endings is another possibility. So for example, if I had this as my outcome and I wanted this to be a second outcome, I can notate this as as repeat ending 1, and notate this as repeat ending 2. Now, you typically don't see just 1 and 2, but in this scene, these can be stacked onwards and onwards. For example, the song Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen has 3 or 4 of these that notate that you would repeat a specific ending each time that you go through the repeat. And that typically, once you repeat a song, let's say 3 or 4 times, that the final time would jump you past the repeat onto a different section or, let's say, a conclusion. So that's how that works. So if I had a third one here, and this repeat was down here, we would play this section first and go back, then 2, and then 3 would jump through to what I have highlighted here. So that's how that works. I'm going to get rid of these just so we don't have as much clutter. Now, beyond repeats, when you have very large sections of music that need to be repeated, we can utilize codas. So you'll see a few different items here. Typically, when you see these written in sheet music, they're much smaller. However, I wrote them larger so we could see them more clearly. You'll see these two symbols we have, DSL coda and coda. So here's how this works. Let's say that in the middle of the section I had choruses and bridges and different things of great lengths. I can basically teleport or jump around the song at will based on where these symbols allow me to go. So for example, the normal flow, if you follow my cursor here, how codas work, we'd ignore the symbol at first, we ignore the coda, we keep going, we'd reach DSL coda. That basically means go back to this symbol. So when we reach this measure after it's played, we now start from here. That carries forward, and now we've reached the coda. The coda now would jump us to this symbol, and we've essentially skipped all of this middle section. So again, this is useful for condensing sheet music, because instead of having to have an entire section duplicated, we can literally just skip over it using codas. This is useful for songs that usually repeat the same pre-chorus and chorus. For example, Set Fire to the Rain by Adele is a perfect example of where codas come in useful. If you ever get your hands on that sheet music, that's a great example of how codas can work. So I know we've covered a lot, but there's still a few more things I'd like to cover. Another one is when you have the same clef, which I know I vaguely mentioned last time. I'm going to delete all the codas here. And I'll get rid of these repeats as well. So basically, let's say I change this measure. I can change, actually, let's do both treble clef. So as we can see, this one's already in treble clef, so if I change this one, you'll now see that this appears because I only assign this to one measure. But now, that means for this measure, both the top half of the lines and the bottom half are in the same clef. So how does that work? Well, if I played everything in this clef an octave up, my hands wouldn't interfere with each other on the keyboard. So basically all this means is that you're playing the notes you see here the same way they'd be written above. If I put a B, or in this case, for this key signature, a B flat in the bass clef would be here. However, you can see because this is in the treble now, it's all the way up here. Or sorry, that's a G. This is a B. Sorry, I do that a lot. That's one of my Achilles heels when it comes to G and B's in the bass clef. So these are written differently in the normal treble and bass arrangement we have. But because this now says treble, a B would be equal to here, which usually would be a D, but it's not a D anymore. It's now a B. This is useful when you want to shift your hands really far up on the keyboard via octaves or really down low. Instead of, again, having it where your notes are completely stretched out and they fall up or down. This can control that. So that's another great tool to utilize when you have parts of different pitches. But it can get tricky as a new pianist to keep in mind all these different factors, and especially when you may not notice right away if that changes, because they don't typically change in the middle of a song. Sometimes you have songs that are completely bass and bass or completely treble and treble for long sections. Every song is different. Um, Another concept is how we notate the use of the sustain pedal. There's a few different ways. The most typical way you'll see it is with a bracket line that looks like this. And you'll see it kind of dragged out. And the segment where the bracket ends and begins, the beginning is where you would put your foot down, and the end is where you let it up. And some songs, I mean, they drag this on forever. This isn't the actual proper bracket to use because Note Flight uses a different one. Um, which is, I'm trying to remember where this is on here. I'm looking for, here we go, dynamics. Pedal down. So you'll see it's notated by this, I call it an asterisk. That's not the name of it, but kind of looks like one, no? And before that, LED period. Now, LED has a few different definitions. It can mean let, ledge, or a French term I know I was touting about the Italian basis of piano, which is true. But this would be, and I'm probably going to butcher this, la chaise vibreur, which basically means let vibrate or let sustain. So that's where the let is kind of a shortened version of saying that, or ledge. Um, and so it's the same concept. You see the symbol, your foot goes down, you take your foot off when you see the other symbol. Now, again, these can be dragged out through multiple measures as we can see here. So you have to keep that in mind. That's how we typically notate pedal use. And if you only see one bracket at the bottom, that would be just for that one clef. If you see it at the top, you usually want to see it for both if you're using the pedal because you can't just use the pedal for one hand. It affects the entire piano in one go because the dampers are actually mechanically lifted off of the strings inside the piano. So beyond pedal notation, let's get into a few complex concepts. I'm going to go down to a different line here. One of them is called grace notes. Grace notes are basically little blips that you hit before a key, and they're written very tiny. Sorry about that. So you'll see it's written very small now. If I put a C here, this is what happens. Little blip. And you can have multiple grace notes. Sometimes I improvise them and I'll put 3 or 4 in certain songs. That just adds another level of depth and complexity to a song. Um, Beyond that, some more note manipulation. There are different ways we can accent or um, articulate songs. There's accents, strong accents, and then you'll see this other one, staccato. So these are two other Italian words that you're going to absolutely need to know. Different types of ways that you physically play keys. It's either legato or staccato. Legato means, leisurely, smoothly, softly, how much you're touching the keys. Staccato is a sharp blip of a key, or you're playing keys very sharp. Classical music will typically alternate between them a lot. So if I play the difference between what a staccato key is and legato, I'm getting rid of that rhythm dot because I don't want to confuse you. This is the difference that you would hear between them. Quick blip of the key versus holding it the normal duration. So that's the typical difference between the two. And this will affect the entire song. If you're told up front by the notation on sheet music to play a song legato, then you need to respect that. But otherwise, songs that are more bouncy will typically be more of a staccato basis. But this is how we actually notate it. In terms of clusters of notes, one of my favorite ones to improvise and that a lot of songs use as outros is rolling chords. So you can see here, we can arpeggiate them and roll them all in one beat. Let's see what that sounds like. So basically, instead of playing all three of these notes simultaneously, you play them in a series. And you can notate this to be arpeggiated in different manners. You'll see with an arrow up top, we play the bottom of the chord first and roll our way up. If we do it descending, it would be played down. If there's no arrow, you typically just play it up. You can adjust the speed at which you roll a chord for dramatics or based on how long that chord is held. And speaking of arpeggios, that's another concept that we're going to cover on the keyboard. Um, but that's basically when you expand out a chord and play each note individually in some sense. The most famous example that I always tell everyone is Someone Like You by Adele. And Clocks by Coldplay is another fantastic example of arpeggiated chords that are written out on sheet music. Um, but in this case, we could take the chord of A flat major. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an E, put a C, I'm going to put a B. But that B is actually B flat. So we have E flat, C, and B flat. I mean A flat, I'm sorry. That would be a diminished chord. This is an arpeggiated chord. You see there's my E flat, C, and A flat. It's arpeggiated. I could repeat that segment because these are all eighth notes, and that would be how many? 6 beats. And that's my arpeggio. So those are some of the most, foundational concepts to cover when it comes to sheet music and different things you'll see. Through some of the other tutorials, we're going to talk about how these hook on a keyboard and different concepts on the keyboard is mainly where we're going to spend our time. We won't spend a lot of time on the sheet music itself for now. But that's it for this series, just a quick two-part series. And make sure to check out the playlist on the tutorials and my song tutorials as well if you're interested in learning some of those, as well as the tutorials for the songs I cover, and just the overviews of them. And all of my sheet music that's available for purchase is available via Patreon. So please go visit that page as well. And don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell to get notified when I make new uploads. Leave a comment if you think I missed anything or any concepts you'd like me to cover or explain in more detail, and I'd be happy to help you with that. Thank you very much.